A human scream of pain echoed through the alien arena as Gladiator Voller slammed his opponent to the ground. Scott Rice muscled to the front of the roaring crowd, the only human in a sea of bloodthirsty aliens. His Navy SEAL bravado pushed aside the fact that he was stranded alone and disoriented on the unfamiliar Halcyon station. The joint training mission aboard the TSS Velhari had gone horribly wrong when a catastrophic engine failure sent the ship's crew, Scott included, hurtling towards the station in escape pods. Scott's pod veered off course from the others. He had crashed into the station's industrial underbelly, separated from his squad. Comms broken, translation implant fried. He was flying blind. Scott's adrenaline spiked watching the hulking lupine Rakari champion Voller decimate his challenger. The assembled horde howled with savage glee at each crushing blow. As the ringmaster called for a new victim to face the undefeated alien warrior, Scott found himself vaulting over the barrier into the arena before he knew what he was doing. Shocked silence fell over the alien mob. Voller whirled to face the human interloper, his black lips curling into a vicious sneer. Scott locked eyes with the towering Gladiator and flashed a cocky grin, even as his heart pounded in his ears. Unarmed and alone, he charged at Voller with a bellowing war cry. The crowd exploded into frenzied cheers as the two titans clashed in a brutal whirlwind of combat. No one dared challenge Voller, until now. Scott's furious charge was abruptly cut short as a phalanx of burly guards, a motley assortment of alien species, stormed the arena. They seized him in a tangle of muscular limbs before he could reach Voller, the crowd's frenzied cheers turning to jeers and hisses. The guards hauled Scott through dank corridors, his feet barely touching the ground. They dragged him into an opulent chamber where Magister Kronos, a corpulent Ferengi, lounged on a hovering dais. The Ferengi's bulbous head gleamed with sweat, and his small eyes glittered with cruel amusement as he surveyed the human captive. "Quite the audacious stunt, human," Kronos sneered through a crackling translator affixed to his gaudy robes. "You dare challenge Voller, the undefeated king of the pits?" Scott jutted his chin defiantly, masking his pounding heart with bravado. "I'm no stranger to long odds. I don't back down from a fight." Kronos leaned forward, his fleshy lips splitting in a yellow-toothed grin. "Is that so? Well then, I have a proposition. Face Voller in an official match. If you win, I'll grant you freedom. If not—" He made a slashing motion across his throat. Scott hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply. "I accept." The guards stripped Scott of his remaining gear, leaving him in only a drab tunic. They shoved him into the Gladiator's holding cells, a warren of dank cages filled with battered aliens nursing wounds and shattered pride. In the gloom, a grizzled Rakari with matted fur and a missing ear regarded Scott with weary eyes. "You're either brave or foolish, human. No one survives Voller." "First time for everything." Scott met the Rakari's gaze. "I'm Scott. Looks like we're cellmates." "Grok," the alien grunted. "I've seen too many die at Voller's claws." His eyes glinted. "But you move well, quick, different from the usual fodder. Perhaps—" And so an unlikely partnership formed. Grok drilled Scott in hand-to-hand techniques, alien pressure points, how to slip a hold or exploit a weakness. Scott's body absorbed the lessons in a patchwork of pain, his muscles burning, his human vulnerabilities all too apparent. But he learned. In snatches of hushed conversation, Grok spoke of the matches, the lifeblood of the station's vicious economy, of slaves and prisoners cast into the ring. Freedom dangled like a mocking dream. Grok's own spirit had long ago broken on that wheel. But Scott's defiance, his unyielding human stubbornness, struck a spark in the old Gladiator, and as whispers of the impending bout spread, that spark caught. The other gladiators began to rally around this strange human, their dull eyes kindling with the faintest ember of hope. And as Scott stood poised to enter the arena, he carried their hope with him, a fragile flame cupped against the howling dark. Scott strode into the arena, the roar of the alien crowd washing over him. Voller loomed across the sand-strewn pit, his lupine eyes glinting with savage anticipation. The human stood dwarfed by his hulking opponent, yet his bearing was one of coiled readiness, a spring tense to unwind. The gong sounded and Volar charged, a juggernaut of snarling fury. Scott dove aside at the last instant, feeling the rush of displaced air as the Rakari's claws raked past. He rolled to his feet, circling, seeking an opening. Volar wheeled, lashing out in a blinding flurry of blows. Scott slipped the strikes with liquid grace, his compact frame a blur of motion. They clashed again and again, Volar's massive strength met by Scott's lightning reflexes and precise strikes to pressure points Grok had drilled into him. The crowd's frenzied cheers took on a note of disbelief as the human held his own against the undefeated champion. Amid the seething spectators, a cloaked figure leaned forward, amber eyes intent beneath a shadowed cowl. Arya Vex studied the human's every move, her quick mind dissecting his unorthodox style, the glints of defiance and calculation behind each fluid evasion and countering blow. Possibilities unfurled behind her eyes, schemes set in motion by this unexpected catalyst. Scott danced at the edges of Volar's reach, pitting human ingenuity against alien might. He ducked a scything kick and dove inside the Rakari's guard, driving an elbow into the nerve cluster at the base of his thick neck. Volar stumbled off balance. Scott pressed his advantage, raining precise strikes on the Gladiator's unprotected flanks. With a roar of frustrated rage, Volar surged forward in a grappling lunge. Scott twisted lithely as they hit the ground, using the Rakari's own momentum to lever him over and into a joint lock. Volar thrashed and bucked, but the human held fast, tendons straining. The moment stretched, taut with strain, until with a cracking pop, Volar's arm gave. The Rakari bellowed in pain and Scott rolled free, coming up in a wary crouch. Cradling his dislocated limb, Volar staggered upright, his eyes blazing with shock and fury. Scott stood his ground, fists raised, as the crowd fell into a stunned hush. A beat, a held breath, then the gong rang out. The match was over. Against adversity, the human had emerged victorious. Pandemonium erupted in the stands, a cacophony of howls and hisses. Scott stood amid the maelstrom, chest heaving, adrenaline still singing through his veins. His eyes met Volar's across the arena, and a flicker of understanding passed between them, a glimpse behind the veil of blood and showmanship to the desperation that fueled them both. Guards swarmed forward to hustle Scott from the arena, back to the dank bowels of the Gladiator's quarters. In the shadowed corridors, a slim figure detached from the wall and fell into step beside him. Arya pushed back her hood, revealing a sharp-featured Ferengi face alight with sly calculation. "Impressive showing out there for a human," she remarked, her voice a smoky purr. "You have a name, or should I just call you the underdog who brought down a legend?" Scott eyed her warily, instincts still thrumming with battle readiness. "Scott Rice. And you are?" "Someone who recognizes opportunity when she sees it. I have a proposition for you, Scott Rice." Arya's lips curved in a razor smile, one that could change the game for both of us. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur as she laid out her offer. An alliance, a chance to strike back at the corrupt powers that pulled the strings on Halcyon. Scott listened, a slow grin spreading across his face. Perhaps there was more than one way to fight on this station, and with Arya's intel and resources at his back, the odds might just be tipping in his favor. But even as plans were set in motion, darker currents stirred in the arena's depths. Volar knelt before Magister Kronos, head bowed as the Ferengi's displeasure buffeted him. The costs of failure etched themselves in the Gladiator's clenched fists, the tremor of barely leashed rage and despair. "You disappoint me, Volar," Kronos spat, jowls quivering. "I took you as a cub, made you a king of the pits, and this is how you repay me?" His eyes glinted cruelly. "Need I remind you of the stakes you fight for?" Volar's growl was a gutted thing, raw with impotent fury. "You swore my family would be safe, that if I fought, if I won, they would—" "They live still. Whether they continue to do so depends on you." Kronos leaned forward, his voice a hissing threat. "Regain your title. Crush the human upstart. Fail again." He let the implication dangle, sharp and barbed. Volar's head snapped up, eyes burning with renewed purpose. His growl built to a snarling crescendo, a vow and a vendetta. The human had bested him once. It would not happen again. Too much rode on the next match. His mate, his hatchlings, his very world tethered to the whims of cruel masters. As Voller stalked from the chamber, a cold purpose settled over him, hardening into a frozen core. He would have his vengeance, and the human would learn the price of crossing the undefeated king of the pits. In the labyrinthine heart of the station, hidden from prying eyes, Scott trained. Arya's resistance fighters put him through his paces, honing the deadly skills Grok had imparted. He pushed himself to the breaking point and beyond, driven by the knowledge that his next battle would be for far more than his own survival. Whispers reached him of the rot festering at Halcyon's core, the vicious cycle of blood and profit that kept the elite's coffers fat while the underclasses scraped by, of slaves and prisoners, disposable fodder for the arena's grist. Each rumor, each glimpse behind the gilded facade, stoked the fire in Scott's gut, the burning need to tear down this rigged system. And through it all, Arya spun her web, gathering secrets and favors, positioning her pieces on a shadowed chessboard. She knew that the human was more than just another pawn. With Scott as her knight, she could strike at the very heart of the Syndicate's power. The pieces were in motion, the game begun, and as Scott readied himself for his fateful rematch against Voller, he could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him, the hopes and fears of the downtrodden pinned to his every move. In the arena, two titans would clash once more, but this time, the fate of Halcyon itself hung in the balance. The wheel of fortune was poised to turn, and which way it fell would shape the lives of all who toiled in the station's neon-lit depths. The stage was set, the battle joined, and Scott Rice stood at the center of it all, a human wildcard thrown into the churning gears of an alien world. Come what may, he would face it as he always had, with fists raised and a rebel yell on his lips, defiant to the last. Scott's muscles burned as he pushed through another grueling training session with Arya's resistance fighters. Sweat dripped from his brow as he dodged a flurry of blows from a burly Tellarite, countering with a swift knee to the abdomen. The alien doubled over, gasping. "Enough!" Arya called from the sidelines. "Scott, a word!" He followed her to a secluded corner of the makeshift gym, tucked away in the bowels of Halcyon Station. Arya's amber eyes glinted in the dim light as she pulled up a holo display. "We've got something," she murmured. "Look." The display flickered to life, showing grainy footage of hooded figures exchanging credit chits in a shadowy corridor. Scott leaned in, squinting at the familiar bulk of one silhouette. "Is that—" "Magister Kronos," Arya confirmed, caught red-handed, paying off arena officials. Her lips curled in a predatory smile. "This is just the beginning. We keep digging, we'll have enough to bury the whole syndicate." Scott nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. "What's our next move?" "Stakeout. Tonight, we've traced a shipment of new gladiators coming in." Arya's voice hardened. "More likely, slaves. We document it, add it to our growing pile of evidence." As darkness fell over Halcyon's neon-lit corridors, Scott crouched beside Arya in a shadowed alcove overlooking the station's auxiliary docking bay. His breath caught as a sleek ship eased into the hangar, its running lights dimmed. "There," Arya whispered, activating her recorder implant. The ship's cargo hold opened with a hiss of hydraulics. A line of chained aliens stumbled out, blinking in confusion at their new surroundings. Scott's fist clenched as he watched brutish guards herd them into a waiting transport. "Those bastards," he growled. Arya laid a steadying hand on his arm. "Easy, we can't blow our cover. Not yet." They watched in tense silence as the last of the new arrivals vanished into Halcyon's depths. Scott committed every detail to memory, stoking the fire of his purpose. Days blurred together in a haze of training and covert operations. Scott and Arya's web of intelligence grew, painting a damning picture of the Syndicate's corruption. But even as they made progress, a shadow loomed on the horizon, Scott's impending rematch with Voller. The Rakari champion had been conspicuously absent from the arena since their last bout. Rumors swirled of brutal retraining sessions, of the Syndicate's iron grip tightening around the fallen king of the pits. It was Grok who brought the whispers to Scott's cell one night, his grizzled face grave in the dim light. "They're breaking him," the old gladiator rasped. "Voller, I've seen it before. The Syndicate, they don't just own your body. They get their hooks in deep, use whatever leverage they can." Scott frowned. "What do you mean?" Grok's eyes were haunted. "Family, loved ones. They find your weak spots, turn the screws until you do anything to make it stop." A chill ran down Scott's spine as the pieces clicked into place. Voller's desperation, the raw fury behind his eyes. It wasn't just about pride or titles. The Rakari was fighting for something far more precious. The next day, as Scott sparred with Arya in a secluded corner of the station, a plan began to form. "We need to get to Voller," he panted, ducking under a vicious roundhouse kick. "If we can turn him, make him see we're on the same side." Arya's eyes narrowed as she considered the idea. "Risky, but if we pull it off?" A slow smile spread across her face. "It could be the key to bringing down the whole rotten system." It took days of careful maneuvering, but finally, Arya's web of contacts bore fruit. Scott found himself in a deserted maintenance corridor, heart pounding as he waited for his erstwhile opponent. Heavy footsteps echoed, and Voller's massive form emerged from the shadows. The Rakari's eyes blazed with suspicion and barely leashed violence. "Speak quickly, human," he growled, "before I decide this is a trap." Scott raised his hands, palms out. "I know about your family," he said softly. "I know what the Syndicate's holding over you." Vollar's snarl died on his lips, replaced by a flicker of raw anguish. "You know nothing," he spat. "I know enough," Scott pressed on. "I know you're not our real enemy here. It's them, the Syndicate. They're the ones pulling all our strings." He took a deep breath, locking eyes with the Rakari. "What if I told you there was a way to beat them? To free your family and every other poor bastard they've got under their thumb?" Vollar's massive chest heaved as he wrestled with conflicting impulses. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "I'm listening." Scott outlined the plan, watching as a spark of hope kindled in Voller's eyes. By the time they parted ways, a fragile alliance had been forged, one that could change the fate of Halcyon itself. The day of the rematch dawned, the station abuzz with anticipation. As Scott strode into the arena, the roar of the crowd washing over him, he caught Voller's eye across the sand-strewn pit. A subtle nod passed between them, sealing their pact. The gong sounded, and they launched into a dance of carefully choreographed violence. To the untrained eye, it was a brutal spectacle. But beneath the surface, a different game was being played. Vollar's claws raked past Scott's face, missing by millimeters. Scott retaliated with a flurry of strikes that looked devastating but inflicted minimal damage. They grappled and threw each other, all while Scott watched for his moment. In the stands, Arya's fingers flew over a hidden console, preparing to unleash their accumulated evidence on Halcyon's unsuspecting populace. The crowd's fervor reached a fever pitch as Scott and Voller traded increasingly audacious moves. Whispers of disbelief began to ripple through the arena. This was too perfect, too precisely matched. Something wasn't right. In the VIP box, Magister Kronos leaned forward, his beady eyes narrowing with suspicion. He barked an order to his guards, pointing at the combatants below. Scott saw the guards advancing and knew their time was running short. He locked eyes with Voller, giving an imperceptible nod. The Rakari roared, lunging forward in a blindingly fast attack. Scott twisted, letting Voller's momentum carry them both to the ground. As they rolled in the sand, Voller's jaws snapped shut inches from Scott's throat, and then went slack as the Rakari let out a carefully rehearsed bellow of pain. Medics swarmed onto the arena floor as Voller writhed in apparent agony. In the confusion, Scott's hand darted to a hidden pocket, retrieving a data chip. He pressed it against a console on the arena wall, praying Arya's tech would do the rest. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the arena's massive view screens flickered, and the truth of Halcyon's corruption spilled across them in a damning flood. Footage of backroom deals and rigged matches, financial records showing the Syndicate's illegal profits, and most damningly, Images of newly acquired slaves being herded into the gladiator pens. A shocked hush fell over the arena, quickly replaced by a rising tide of outrage. In the VIP box, Magister Kronos' face contorted with fury and terror as he realized his empire was crumbling. Scott hauled Voller to his feet as the first wave of spectators vaulted the barriers, storming onto the arena floor. They locked eyes, a moment of understanding passing between them. "Your family," Scott shouted over the growing chaos. "Where are they?" Volar's eyes blazed with renewed purpose. "The lower levels, Sector 7. Scott nodded, already scanning the arena for familiar faces. He spotted Grok rallying a group of fellow gladiators, their chains falling away as they turned on their guards. "Let's go," he growled to Voller. "Time to finish this." Together, Human and Rakari plunged into the roiling crowd, fighting their way toward freedom, and the final confrontation with the architects of their shared torment. Scott and Voller fought their way through the chaos of the arena, shouldering past panicked spectators and dodging clashes between newly freed gladiators and overwhelmed guards. They burst into a maintenance corridor, the distant roar of the uprising fading behind them. "This way," Voller growled, his massive frame barely fitting through the narrow passage. They descended through Halcyon's industrial underbelly, the air growing thick with the stench of lubricants and ozone. Scott's muscles burned, but adrenaline kept him moving. After what felt like hours of twisting corridors and steep catwalks, they reached a nondescript bulkhead. Voller's claws trembled as he input a code. The door hissed open, revealing a dimly lit chamber. Huddled forms stirred in the shadows. "Father?" A small voice filled with disbelief and hope. Volar dropped to his knees as tiny Rakari forms swarmed him. Scott hung back, giving the family their moment. He scanned the room, counting a dozen other prisoners, different species, all wearing the same haunted look. "We need to move," Scott said, hating to interrupt. "It won't take long for the syndicate to—" A distant explosion rocked the station. Voller's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Scott's. "Too late," the Rakari rumbled. They gathered the prisoners, Voller carrying 2 exhausted younglings. Scott took point, leading them through the labyrinth of access tunnels. The sounds of battle grew closer. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a squad of armored troops. Scott's heart sank as he recognized the insignia, not syndicate thugs, but the elite shock troops of the Intergalactic Corporation. "Halt!" the lead soldier's voice crackled through his helmet speaker. "By order of Commander Vorak, this station is under IGC control. Surrender immediately." Scott's mind raced. He knew of the IGC, a corporate behemoth with tentacles in every sector of the galaxy. If they were here— "Like hell!" Scott spat. He charged forward, catching the soldiers off guard. His fist connected with the leader's faceplate, spiderwebbing the material. Voller roared, barreling into the others. It was over in seconds. Scott scooped up a fallen pulse rifle, tossing another to Voller. "We need to find Arya," Scott said, checking the weapons charge. "She'll know what's happening." They fought their way through pockets of resistance, IGC troops facing off against a mix of gladiators and civilian protesters. Scott's stolen comm unit crackled with chatter. IGC was locking down key sectors, rounding up anyone connected to the uprising. They found Arya cornered in a comm center, surrounded by the smoking remains of IGC combat drones. Her amber eyes blazed as she saw Scott. "Took you long enough," she said, a grim smile on her face. "We've got a problem." "Yeah, I noticed," Scott replied. "IGC, how bad?" Arya's fingers danced over a holo display. "Bad. They've got a battlecruiser in orbit, more on the way, and their ground forces—" She shook her head. "We're outgunned." "Not yet, we're not." Scott's mind whirled with half-formed plans. "We've got fighters, we've got determination, and we've got you." Arya raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "You said it yourself. Information is power." Scott gestured at the banks of computers. "Use your network. Spread the word. Show everyone what's really happening here." A slow smile spread across Arya's face. "Oh, I like the way you think, human." As Arya worked her digital magic, Scott and Voller coordinated with other resistance cells. Gladiators who'd spent years honing their combat skills now turned those talents against IGC's professional soldiers. The station became a battleground, with freed fighters using their intimate knowledge of Halcyon's layout to ambush and outmaneuver the invaders. Scott found himself in the thick of the fighting, leading a ragtag group of aliens and humans alike. They struck from the shadows, disappearing into maintenance shafts and unused corridors before IGC could respond. But it wasn't enough. For every IGC soldier they took down, 2 more seemed to appear. Scott watched good fighters fall, saw the fear growing in the eyes of those who remained. Then it happened. They were pinned down in a storage bay, IGC troops advancing from 3 directions. Scott saw the determined set of Volar's massive jaw, the way the Rakari's eyes flicked to a structural support beam. "No," Scott breathed, realizing Volar's intent a moment too late. Volar charged, his bulk slamming into the beam. Metal shrieked and buckled. The ceiling came down in a cascade of debris, cutting off the IGC advance and burying Volar beneath it. Scott's scream of rage was lost in the rumble of collapsing metal. He surged forward, but strong arms held him back. "He's gone," a voice hissed in his ear. "Don't waste his sacrifice." Numb with shock and grief, Scott let himself be pulled away. They regrouped in an abandoned maintenance hub, the ragtag remains of his force looking to him for guidance. Scott closed his eyes, took a deep breath. When he opened them, cold fury had replaced despair. "Enough defense," he growled. "Time to take the fight to them." He outlined his plan, a lightning strike on IGC's makeshift command center. It was risky, maybe suicidal, but no one argued. They'd all lost too much to back down now. They moved through Halcyon's guts like ghosts, using access ways and ventilation shafts. When they burst into IGC's command post, the element of surprise gave them a crucial advantage. Scott fought like a man possessed, Volar's death driving him to heights of controlled fury. IGC troops fell before him, their armor useless against his precision strikes. In the chaos, Scott spotted a figure in an ornate uniform. Commander Vorak himself. The alien's eyes widened in shock as Scott vaulted a console, closing the distance between them. "You!" Vorak spat. "The human gladiator. I should have known you'd be behind this." "It's over," Scott said, leveling his captured rifle at Vorak's chest. "Call off your troops." Vorak sneered. "You think this changes anything? IGC will never let this rebellion stand. The commander's words cut off as the room's main view screen flickered to life. A familiar face filled the display, weathered and stern. "This is Master Chief Rodriguez of the United Earth Navy," the man said. "We are responding to a distress call from this station. IGC forces stand down immediately or face the consequences." Scott's heart leapt. He knew that voice, that face, his old CO, the man who'd trained him to be a SEAL. As IGC troops lowered their weapons in confusion, Scott allowed himself a grim smile. The real fight for Halcyon's future was just beginning. The familiar voice of Master Chief Rodriguez echoed through the command center, and for a moment Scott allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Commander Vorak's face twisted in frustration as he realized his gambit had failed. With a snarl, he reached for a hidden weapon, but Scott was faster. A swift, precise strike left the IGC leader unconscious on the floor. "Secure him," Scott ordered, already moving towards the communications array. He keyed in the frequency he'd memorized years ago during his SEAL training. "This is Scott Reeves, former Navy SEAL, confirming friendly forces on Halcyon Station. We've neutralized the IGC command center." There was a brief pause before Rodriguez's gruff voice replied. "Damn good to hear your voice, Reeves. Hold your position. We're coming in." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Earth Navy peacekeepers swept through the station, disarming IGC troops and securing key areas. Scott worked alongside them, his intimate knowledge of Halcyon's layout proving invaluable. As the immediate crisis subsided, Scott found himself in a makeshift briefing room with Rodriguez and key members of the resistance. Aria's holographic form flickered to life, her expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "The IGC's propaganda machine is in shambles," she reported. "I've made sure the truth about Halcyon is spreading across every network in the sector." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Good work, but we've got a long road ahead. This station needs stability and fast." Scott leaned forward, his mind racing. "We need a governing council, something temporary, to keep things running until we can hold proper elections." "Agreed," Rodriguez said, "and I think I'm looking at its leader." Scott blinked, taken aback. "Me? I'm not cut out for—" "Cut the modesty, Reeves," Rodriguez interrupted. "These people trust you. You know this station better than anyone. We need someone to oversee the transition, and you're it." Reluctantly, Scott nodded. He knew Rodriguez was right. Halcyon needed guidance, and he couldn't walk away now. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Scott worked tirelessly, coordinating with Earth Navy personnel to establish new security protocols. He personally oversaw the vetting of recruits, determined to root out any lingering IGC loyalists. One morning, as he reviewed reports in his makeshift office, Arya's hologram materialized. "We've got a problem," she said without preamble. "Long-range sensors picked up a flotilla entering the system. It's Proc." Scott's eyes hardened. He'd heard whispers about the Kralathi warlord, a brutal opportunist who'd no doubt seen Halcyon as ripe for the taking. "How long?" he asked. "Hours at most." Scott nodded, already formulating a plan. "Alert our defense teams. I want every fighter we've got ready to launch." He strode from the office, tapping his comm unit. "Grok, gather your best. We've got a welcoming party to prepare." When Proc's ships dropped out of hyperspace, they found Halcyon far from the easy target they'd anticipated. A swarm of fighters, piloted by former gladiators now fighting for a cause they believed in, tore into the mercenary fleet. Scott coordinated the defense from Halcyon's command center, his SEAL training allowing him to remain calm amid the chaos. He watched with grim satisfaction as Proc's forces crumbled under the unexpected resistance. In less than an hour, it was over. Proc's flagship turned tail and fled, leaving behind a graveyard of disabled ships and escape pods. As the adrenaline of battle faded, Scott found himself facing a new challenge. Representatives from neighboring systems were clamoring to open negotiations with Halcyon. Some offered support, while others sought reassurances that the station wouldn't become a threat to regional stability. Arya proved invaluable, using her network of contacts to arrange meetings and smooth over potential conflicts. Scott found himself thrust into the unfamiliar role of diplomat, arguing passionately for Halcyon's right to chart its own course. One evening, as Scott pored over plans to repurpose the arena, a familiar hulking form entered his office. Ambassador Thrask, the Rakari envoy, regarded Scott with a mixture of respect and wariness. "You've done much for my people," Thrask rumbled, "but many Gortraks still languish in your cells." Scott nodded, understanding the delicate situation. "We're working on repatriation plans, but some have chosen to stay. They see a future here." Thrask's eyes narrowed. "And you would welcome them?" "Halcyon is changing," Scott said firmly. "Anyone willing to be part of that change has a place here." As the Rakari left, Scott turned back to the schematics before him. The arena, once a symbol of oppression, would become a beacon of hope. He envisioned classrooms, workshops, a place where the station's underclass could forge new paths. A chime at the door interrupted his thoughts. Cora Rail, a human engineer he'd come to trust, entered with a datapad. "The election protocols are ready for review," she said. Scott nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Good. It's time for Halcyon to choose its own leaders." Cora hesitated. "You know, there's a lot of support for you to run." Scott shook his head. "No, I've seen what power does to people. Halcyon needs a clean slate." As Cora left, Scott turned to the viewport, gazing out at the stars. Halcyon's future stretched before him, full of challenges and possibilities. He allowed himself a small smile, knowing that whatever came next, the station and its people were finally free to choose their own path. Scott's gaze swept across the bustling command center of Halcyon Station. Screens flickered with reports from neighboring systems, each one a potential target for Proc's expansionist ambitions. He turned to Arya's holographic form, her expression grim. "We can't fight this alone," Scott said, his voice low. "We need allies." Arya nodded, her fingers dancing over invisible controls. "I've already reached out to contacts in nearby sectors. Many are eager to meet, especially after word of our victory spread." Within days, Halcyon's docking bays filled with diplomatic vessels from a dozen different species. Scott found himself thrust into the role of mediator, his tactical mind now focused on forging alliances rather than battlefield strategies. In a repurposed arena chamber, Scott addressed the assembled delegates. "Proc threatens us all. United, we stand a chance. Divided, we fall one by one." As he laid out his plan for a coalition defense force, Scott could see the spark of hope ignite in alien eyes. When the Rakari ambassador, Thrask, pledged his people's legendary warriors to the cause, others quickly followed suit. The vote was unanimous. Scott found himself appointed Supreme Military Commander of the fledgling coalition, a position he accepted with a mix of purpose and trepidation. Arya's intel network proved invaluable as they scrambled to predict Proc's next move. When the warlord's forces struck an Alari mining colony, the coalition was ready. Scott stood on the bridge of the flagship, a converted luxury liner now jam-packed with weapons. Around him, a motley crew of former gladiators and professional soldiers worked in harmony. "All ships, execute Maneuver Sigma 3, Scott ordered as Proc's fleet came into view. The coalition vessels moved with practiced precision, their formation disrupting the Kralathi attack patterns. The battle raged for hours, a brutal dance of energy weapons and missile salvos. Scott's tactical acumen shone as he exploited weaknesses in Proc's defenses, turning the tide of the engagement. As the last Kralathi ship retreated, Scott allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but he knew this was only the beginning. Weeks passed, marked by a series of intense skirmishes across the sector. The coalition held its ground, but Proc's seemingly endless resources threatened to outlast them. In the nebula-shrouded shipyards of Kordax, Scott saw their chance. He gathered his most trusted lieutenants, outlining a daring plan to strike at the heart of Proc's war machine. The attack was swift and surgical. Coalition stealth ships slipped past Kralathi patrols, planting explosive charges on key structures. When the charges detonated, the shipyards erupted in a cascade of destruction. Proc's fury was palpable, even across the vastness of space. The warlord gathered his remaining forces for a final, desperate assault on Halcyon itself. As the Kralathi armada approached, Scott unveiled the trap he'd meticulously prepared. Cloaked mines, painstakingly planted during previous engagements, activated en masse. Proc's vanguard disintegrated in a series of silent explosions. In the chaos that followed, Scott led a strike team in a daring boarding action against Proc's flagship. The corridors rang with the clash of steel and the whine of energy weapons as they fought their way to the bridge. There they found Proc himself, surrounded by his elite guard. The Kralathi warlord sneered at Scott, his voice a guttural growl. "You think you've won, human?" Scott didn't waste breath on a reply. He and Thrask moved as one, years of gladiatorial training evident in every fluid motion. The Praetorians fell before their onslaught, leaving Proc alone and cornered. With the warlord's capture, the remaining Kralathi forces quickly surrendered. The threat that had loomed over the sector for so long was finally neutralized. On Halcyon Station, crowds gathered to celebrate their hard-won victory. Scott stood before them, acutely aware of the power he now wielded. He thought of the arena, of the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. His decision was made in that moment. Scott stepped to the podium, his voice carrying across the assembled throng. "Today we stand united," he began. "But true unity comes not from a single leader, but from the collective will of free people." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Scott continued. "I hereby relinquish my position as Supreme Commander. A council, chosen by you, will guide us forward." Gasps and whispers filled the air. Scott raised his hand for silence. "My path leads elsewhere. I return to Earth to complete my training as a SEAL. Not as a conquering hero, but as a soldier who has much yet to learn." As the implications of his words sank in, Scott could see the respect in the eyes of those around him. He had refused the mantle of power, choosing instead to serve. The newly formed coalition council gathered to bid him farewell. Thrask clasped Scott's arm in a warrior's grip. "You have earned the respect of the Rakari, Scott Reeves. Our songs will tell of your deeds." Scott boarded the shuttle that would take him back to Earth, his mind already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. The SEAL training would push him to his limits, but he was ready. He had faced down warlords and forged alliances between stars. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. As Halcyon receded from view, Scott allowed himself a small smile. He had helped build something greater than himself, a coalition of free worlds standing together against tyranny. Now it was time for a new chapter, one that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. Scott's shuttle docked with Halcyon Station, the familiar hum of the airlock cycling open. He stepped onto the deck, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and found himself face to face with a sea of expectant faces. "Welcome home, hero!" The cry erupted from dozens of throats, human and alien alike. Scott blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude. Arya's holographic form materialized beside him, a rare smile playing across her lips. "I tried to keep it low-key," she said, her voice tinged with amusement, "but word spread faster than a Krolathi virus." Scott nodded, his expression a mix of appreciation and discomfort. He made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting words of thanks. Each person had a story, a loved one saved, a home protected, and Scott listened, deflecting praise to the brave men and women who had fought alongside him. In the repurposed arena, now a bustling education center, Scott found himself surrounded by coalition dignitaries. Cora Rail, her hair streaked with more gray than he remembered, approached with a data pad. "The offer still stands," she said, handing him the device. "Captaincy in the Halcyon Defense Fleet. We could use someone with your experience." Scott scanned the document, then handed it back with a regretful shake of his head. "I appreciate the offer, Cora, but my place is with the SEALs. There's still work to be done." Cora nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You'll always have a home here, Scott." The ceremony that followed was a blur of speeches and accolades. Scott stood at attention, his mind already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. Arya's warning about rising anti-human sentiment gnawed at him, a reminder that peace was a fragile thing. As the formalities drew to a close, a hush fell over the crowd. Ambassador Thrask stepped forward, his massive form dwarfing Scott. The Rakari's voice rumbled through the chamber. "Scott Reeves, you have proven yourself a warrior of unmatched valor," Thrask intoned. "The High Council of Rakar has decreed you an honored warrior of our people, the first human to bear this title." Scott's eyes widened as Thrask presented an ornate blade, its curved edge gleaming in the station's lights. He accepted the weapon with both hands, feeling its perfect balance. "I am honored beyond words," Scott said, his voice thick with emotion. "This blade will serve as a reminder of the bonds we've forged, not just between our two peoples, but all those who stand for justice in this galaxy." As the celebrations wound down, Scott made his way to the docking bay where the Dauntless waited. Arya met him at the airlock, her holographic form flickering slightly. "I've arranged a little surprise," she said, gesturing to a group of familiar faces nearby. Grok stood at the front, his scarred visage split by a toothy grin. "Looks like we're heading to Earth together, boss," the former Gladiator rumbled. Scott clasped Grok's massive hand, a grin spreading across his own face. "I can't think of better company for the trip." A small sound drew Scott's attention. Sirai, Volar's mate, approached with her brood of hatchlings. One of the young Rakari stepped forward, clutching something in its clawed hands. "For you," the hatchling chirped, presenting Scott with a familiar object, Volar's shattered talisman. Scott knelt, gently taking the keepsake. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll keep it safe until we meet again." As Scott boarded the Dauntless, he paused at the threshold. Halcyon's gleaming form filled the viewport, a beacon of hope in the vastness of space. He touched the honor blade at his hip, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. The ship's engines hummed to life, and Scott turned his gaze toward Earth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same commitment that had carried him through the crucible of Halcyon. The galaxy was changing, and Scott Reeves was ready to help shape that change. The Dauntless touched down on a rain-slicked tarmac at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Scott stepped onto Earth soil for the first time in years, inhaling the salty Pacific air. His fellow SEAL candidates flanked him, their faces a mix of awe and respect. Commander Briggs approached, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Welcome home, Reeves. You've got some catching up to do." The next weeks blurred into a grueling rhythm of training exercises, tactical simulations, and endurance tests. Scott's off-world experiences gave him an edge, but he pushed himself relentlessly, determined to earn his place alongside his teammates. On a fog-shrouded morning, Scott stood at attention with his fellow candidates. Admiral Carlson pinned the coveted Naval Special Warfare insignia, the SEAL Trident, to his chest. "You've more than earned this, son," the Admiral said quietly. As Scott savored the moment, a commotion erupted at the edge of the gathering. Protesters waved signs emblazoned with xenophobic slogans, "Earth for humans," and "No alien alliances." Scott's eyes hardened as he read their placards. The jubilation of the ceremony evaporated, replaced by a gnawing unease. Later that evening, Scott sat in Admiral Chiang's office, watching news footage of anti-alien riots across major cities. The Admiral's voice was grim. "This Terra primacy movement is gaining traction. We need to counter their narrative before it's too late." Scott leaned forward. "What do you need me to do?" "Be our voice, Scott. Show them the true face of our alien allies. Remind humanity what we stand to gain through cooperation." The next month saw Scott crisscrossing Earth and its colonies. He spoke at universities, community centers, and spaceports. Grok and other Halcyon veterans joined him, their presence a living testament to interspecies cooperation. On Ganymede, Scott addressed a packed auditorium. "I've seen the best and worst of humanity out there among the stars," he said, his voice carrying to the farthest seats. "But I've also witnessed the incredible potential when we work together with other species. The Rakari stood beside us against Proc. The Ala'ari shared their medical knowledge to save countless lives. We are stronger united than we could ever be alone." As applause filled the hall, Scott caught sight of a group of scowling faces near the back. Their eyes held a dangerous glint of fanaticism. The attack came swiftly. During a cultural exchange event on New Eden, an agrarian colony, explosions rocked the pavilion. Scott's training kicked in as he shouted orders, guiding panicked civilians to safety. Through the smoke, he saw a group of colonists turn on their Rakari guests, brandishing makeshift weapons. Scott's team moved with practiced efficiency, forming a protective cordon around the aliens. "This way!" Scott shouted, leading them toward the waiting shuttles. Energy weapons sizzled past his head as Terra Primacy supporters opened fire. Scott returned fire, his shots precise and non-lethal, buying time for the evacuation. As the last shuttle lifted off, Scott allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. No lives lost, but the cost of this victory greatly troubled on him. Back on Earth, Scott stood before a sea of young faces at Stanford University. The recent attack had only strengthened his persistence. "We stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his experiences. "We can give in to fear and isolationism, or we can embrace the incredible diversity our galaxy offers. I've walked on worlds you've only dreamed of, fought alongside beings whose courage and honor rival any humans. The stars are not a threat. They're an invitation to become something greater." As Scott's words ignited a spark of wonder in the audience, a commotion erupted at the back of the hall. A group of protesters unfurled banners bearing the face of Janus Brock, Terra Primacy's charismatic leader. "Traitor!" they shouted, their faces contorted with rage. "Human extinction is not a solution." Scott held up a hand, silencing the security team moving to remove the protesters. He addressed them directly, his voice calm but firm. "I hear your fear, but I've seen firsthand the cost of giving in to that fear. If you'll listen, I'd like to tell you about a Rakari warrior named Voller who gave his life to save mine. A human who sacrificed everything to save those who once enslaved him." The protesters fell silent, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. Scott seized the moment, gesturing to Thrask, who stood silently at the side of the stage. Ambassador Thrask, would you share your perspective on human-Rakari relations? The towering Rakari stepped forward, his voice rumbling through the auditorium. When I first encountered humans, I saw only potential slaves or enemies. Scott Reeves showed me the error of that thinking. He proved that courage and honor know no species. As Thrask spoke, Scott noticed a shift in the crowd. The hostility began to ebb, replaced by a tentative openness. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. The success of the Stanford event fueled Scott's willpower. He redoubled his efforts, crisscrossing Earth and its colonies with a message of unity. Grok and other Halcyon veterans joined him, their presence a living testament to interspecies cooperation. On Mars, Scott stood before a massive crowd gathered in the sprawling Ares City Dome. The transparent ceiling revealed the rust-colored Martian landscape beyond, a stark reminder of humanity's expanding horizons. Today we stand united, Scott began, his voice carrying across the assembled throng. Not just as humans, but as members of a galactic community. The challenges we face are too great for any one species to confront alone. As Scott spoke, he noticed a disturbance at the edge of the crowd. A figure in a maintenance uniform pushed through the press of bodies, moving with urgent purpose. Scott's combat-honed instincts screamed danger. "Everyone, clear the area!" Scott shouted, leaping from the stage. He sprinted towards the suspicious individual, his heart pounding in his ears. The world exploded in a cacophony of light and sound. Scott felt himself lifted off his feet, hurled through the air by an invisible force. He slammed into the ground, pain lancing through his body. Darkness claimed him. Scott drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of sensation and memory flickering through his mind. The acrid smell of smoke, the taste of blood in his mouth, distant voices, urgent and fearful. When he finally clawed his way back to full awareness, Scott found himself in a sterile medical bay. The hum of engines told him he was aboard a ship. Admiral Xiang's face swam into view, etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. "Welcome back, Scott," he said softly. Scott tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He settled for a questioning look. Xiang's expression darkened. "It was bad, Scott. A Terra primacy bomb. We're still counting the casualties, human and alien alike." Scott closed his eyes, grief washing over him. When he opened them again, a new willpower burned in their depths. "Grok," he managed to rasp. Xiang's silence was answer enough. Scott turned his face away, allowing a single tear to trace down his cheek. As the medical frigate sped towards Earth, Scott's body mended, but the wounds to his spirit ran deep. He pored over reports of the aftermath, watching in horror as Terra primacy seized on the tragedy to further their xenophobic agenda. In a secure facility on Luna, Scott stood before a holding cell. On the other side of the force field, a man with icy blue eyes and a cruel smile regarded him with contempt. "Janus Brock," Scott said, his voice hard. "I've come to hear your explanation." Brock's smile widened. "Explanation? I've done humanity a service. This is just the beginning, Reeves. We'll purge the alien influence and restore our rightful place in the galaxy." Scott's fist clenched at his sides. Every fiber of his being screamed for retribution. He thought of Grok, of the countless lives lost on Mars. It would be so easy to give in to that rage, to make Brock pay for his crimes. But as he stared into those cold eyes, Scott saw something familiar. He recognized the same hatred, the same fear that had driven the Gladiator masters on Halcyon. In that moment, he understood the true nature of the battle he faced. Scott unclenched his fists, his voice steady as he spoke. "You're wrong, Brock. Humanity's strength lies in our ability to adapt, to learn from others. Your way leads only to more suffering." He turned and walked away, leaving Brock's taunts echoing behind him. There was work to be done. In the days that followed, Scott threw himself into the fight against Terra Primacy's poisonous ideology. He spoke at Brock's court-martial, delivering a powerful statement on the importance of unity in the face of extremism. As the verdict was read, Scott stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the assembled dignitaries and media. Today, we've shown that justice knows no species, he declared. But our work is far from finished. We must continue to build bridges, to foster understanding between all sentient beings. The response was electric. Across Earth and its colonies, millions took to the streets in a show of solidarity. Humans and aliens stood side by side, rejecting the politics of division and fear. On a crisp autumn day, Scott stood before a solemn gathering in San Francisco. A memorial to the victims of the Mars attack gleamed in the sunlight, its smooth surface etched with names from a dozen species. As Scott placed a wreath at the base of the monument, a familiar voice rumbled behind him. "You honor us with your presence, Warrior Reeves." Scott turned to find Ambassador Thrask standing nearby, flanked by a delegation of Rakari. The ambassador stepped forward, holding a familiar object in his massive hands. "Grok fell as he lived, with honor and courage," Thrask intoned. "We entrust you with his honor blade, Scott Reeves. May it serve as a reminder of the bond between our peoples." Scott accepted the weapon with trembling hands, feeling its perfect balance. He raised it high, letting the sunlight glint off its polished surface. "I will carry this blade and the ideals it represents," Scott vowed, his voice ringing out across the gathering. "Not just for Grok, but for all who dream of a united galaxy." As the ceremony concluded, Admiral Xiang approached Scott with a datapad. "The offer still stands," he said. "We need voices like yours in the diplomatic corps." Scott studied the document, considering the path before him. After a long moment, he handed it back with a shake of his head. "My place is out there," he said, gesturing to the sky. "On the front lines, protecting the ideals we fought so hard for." Xiang nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Godspeed, Scott. We'll be watching your career with great interest." Days later, Scott stood in the launch bay of a nondescript frigate, Grok's blade secured at his side. As he prepared to board, he caught sight of his reflection in the polished hull. The man who stared back at him was changed, tempered by loss and hardship, but unbroken. Scott took a deep breath, then stepped into the airlock. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as he always had, with courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of unity. The frigate's engines hummed to life, carrying Scott towards his next mission. As Earth receded from view, he allowed himself a small smile. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The lessons of Halcyon, the sacrifices of friends like Grok, these would light his path through the darkness. Scott settled into his quarters, fingers tracing the intricate patterns on Grok's blade. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to bridge the divide between species. For now, he closed his eyes, letting the gentle vibration of the ship lull him into a dreamless sleep.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.